Welcome everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Today's author event is very special, so I'm really happy you could all join us. My name is Allison Bainbridge. I will be hosting this event. We're going to hear from Jan-Phillip Sendker today about his final book in a beloved trilogy. When his book, The Heart Remembers, arrived at the store last week, some of us in the store got so excited. We got a little emotional because the first in this series, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, is on several of our longtime book staff's list of favorites, including myself. It was such a powerful book for me when I read it that I became sort of obsessed with the idea of visiting Burma and convinced, or Myanmar as it is now known. And I eventually was able to fulfill my dream and convince my family to join me about 8 years ago. We went, and that it remains one of the most memorable experiences of my life. So it's with great anticipation and some sadness that Jan-Phillip has gifted us with the third and final book in this trilogy. In this book, 12-year-old Ko Bo lives with his uncle, Yuba, in Kala, a town in Burma. An unusually perceptive child, Bobo can read people's emotions in their eyes. This acute sensitivity only makes his unconventional home life more difficult. His father comes to visit him once a year, and he can hardly remember his mother, who for unclear reasons keeps herself away from her son. Everything changes, though, when Bobo discovers the story of his parents' great love, which threatens to break down in the whirlwind of political events, and of his mother's mysterious sickness. Convinced that he can heal her and reunite their family, Bobo decides to set out in search of his parents. Jan-Phillip is an internationally best-selling author born in Hamburg in 1960. And at the age of 13, he wrote in a school essay about what he would like to do as a grown-up. I thought this was wonderful. He said he wanted to write novels. He was the American correspondent for Stern from 1990 to 95, and its Asian correspondent from 95 to 99. His first novel, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, was published in 2012, and the sequel, A Well-Tempered Heart, appeared in 2014. His books are translated into more than 35 languages. His Burma novels, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats and A Well-Tempered Heart, have been #1 bestsellers in many countries. So it is now with great pleasure that I give you to Jan-Phillip. Take it away.
Thank you very, very much for your wonderful introduction. And I will talk today not just about the new book, but I would like to talk about the whole trilogy, even though I think all 3 books are standalones as well. You can read the last one first, The Heart Remembers, and then switch to the first one, or you follow the order. It's really up to you. I wrote them the way that they belong together, but they stand by themselves as well. The first question I'm very often asked is, why a German author writes 3 novels set in Burma? This is pretty far away from Germany. And I have to tell you a little bit about my experience there, and then I think in the end you will understand. The first time I came to Burma, or as it's known now, Myanmar, was in 1995, 25 years ago, 26 years ago. And in those days, I was the Asia correspondent of Stern magazine, the German weekly. And it was weird because I was just transferred from New York to Hong Kong, where our office for Asia was. And I was very busy. I had to cover China, I had to cover Japan. And there was kind of, and now it already sounds a little mysterious, a little Burmese, there was an inner voice telling me, go to Burma. In those days, if you had told me, please point out where this Burma is on the world map, I don't know if I would have found it. Maybe I would have mixed it up with Bangladesh or Thailand or whatever, but I wanted to go to Burma. In those days, nobody went to Burma because there was a military regime there and the country was pretty isolated. For 30 years, almost nobody got in and nobody got out. They had no clue about us and we had no clue about Burma. In 1995, it wasn't on anybody's map. Not for tourists, not for politicians, not for the UN or for anybody. There were really very few people going, but I wanted to go. And then somehow I convinced Stern to send me there for a mysterious story, which never worked out. But I got there. And I remember it's just an hour flight from Bangkok to Yangon. That was the capital in those days. And it was unbelievable. Within this hour, I traveled 80 to 100 years in time. And that's an experience which I think you do not have anymore in the world, anywhere, unless you travel, I don't know, deep into the Amazon or wherever, and you visit a very small minority. But Burma is not a small minority somewhere in the jungle. It's a big country. It's as big as France and Germany combined. There are 55 million people living there. So in those days, I flew and I arrived in Yangon, the capital with 7 million people. And I remember it was dark, almost dark when I arrived. So like maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock in the evening. The plane from Bangkok was empty. And we approached the airport and we flew over Yangon, as I said, a big city, and there were no lights. It was really as if a plane just flew over called Madeira now, probably many more lights than I saw in Yangon. So we touched down and they had a very, very small terminal. And I got into an old car. There were, as I said, almost no passengers, no taxis. And very slowly we drove into town. And I just came from Hong Kong and Bangkok, big cities. They were bright and lots of traffic and people. Here, there were no lights, there were no neon signs, there were people who were playing football on the streets, monks all over, old places falling apart. Everything was very quiet and dark and friendly. It was warm. And I was so confused that I asked my driver if there was a McDonald's in town, because I wanted to see how fast the rest had approached. And he kept driving and said, "McDonald's, you said. Is the guy maybe Scottish?" So he had no clue. He had never heard about a restaurant chain. And even now, last time I was there was no McDonald's, not yet, a Burger King, a single Burger King at the airport, but no McDonald's. And so they had no clue. And I realized very, very soon, I had no clue about this country either. It was, as I said, it was the evening. I put my stuff into the hotel and then I started walking and the streets were full of people. And then all of a sudden it went dark. The whole neighborhood went dark. It was a blackout. That happened a lot in those days. It still happens, but if it happens now, it takes about a few seconds and then you hear the noises of generators and it gets bright again. In those days, people didn't have any generators. So it was dark, but it didn't keep dark long because people knew it and they lit candles. And then they put the candles on tables and the tea houses, on sidewalks, in their windows and so on. So after a few minutes, the whole neighborhood was just lit by candles. It was pure magic. And then I walked there and I heard strange sounds, people singing, men singing. And I followed these songs and I ended up in a park, in a courtyard, at a river, and it was always the same scene. There was a young man and a young woman. Very often the man had a guitar and the man sang songs to the girl. And much later I learned that it's a very Burmese tradition that when a young couple falls in love, they get together and the man sings love songs for the girl. And I found that a very beautiful tradition. I was actually very happy that it's not a German tradition, because I would still be single, because I definitely cannot sing. But, to listen, it was wonderful to observe. And I spent 3 weeks in Burma, and I really fell in love with the people and the country. I mean, it was, and it is a very poor country. The life expectancy is 50-something average. You saw it, the city was falling apart in those days. I traveled around the countryside. There was a lot of poverty. It was a military dictatorship, but strangely, you couldn't really, at the surface, you didn't see it. I didn't see many soldiers. I didn't see many police officers. I started to talk to people. I became friends with some, and then I realized what was going on underneath, under the surface. But you couldn't see it. What you could see was with how much dignity people were carrying their load, the difficult circumstances, the difficult life. I never ever have met a Burmese who has pitied himself, for instance, or really complained. And I went back as often as I could, since 1995. I think I've been there many times, probably 30 times. And on every trip, I learned so much, not just about a different culture, different country, but also about myself, of course. I remember, I think it was on my second trip, a very good friend of mine in Cologne, where I ended up by chance, and I completely fell in love with this town where all my novels are set, all three. I fell in love with Cologne, and I met a wonderful man who had been born there and spoke English very well, and he took me on a trip, 2-day trip, hiking trip, and he wanted to show me a different kind of Burma. And we ended up in the evening in a small village. I think it was the Pao village. And my friend, he spoke the Pao language, and they knew him, they trusted him, and he brought the stranger. And I was greeted like the guest of honor because I was the friend of their friend. And we could stay at the headman's small hut. And people came together, and I could ask them questions, and they asked me questions. And it was a wonderful experience. We stayed overnight, and the next day I had to leave with my friend. And I learned another Burmese tradition that when you visit a friend or people and then you leave, it's not just saying, oh, bye-bye, have a nice trip, you get a present, a very lovely present. This time, these people are extremely poor. They didn't have much to give, but they had tea. They grew tea. That's how they made a living. So I got a bag of tea. And it was not just the village head. I had the feeling the whole village came. There were at least 100, maybe 150 people all surrounding us, looking at me, this funny, strange-looking man from abroad. And I got a bag of tea, but not this size, not this size. It was the size of a potato bag. Huge. And I was really touched. I said, oh, this is lovely, and I love to drink tea. I said, this is lovely, wonderful, but it's much too much. Please, do you have a smaller bag? Oh, the headman said, don't worry, it is not just for you. This is for the whole family, of course. Ah, okay, the whole family, yeah, nice. At that time, I was living in Hong Kong, and my wife was still living in New York. So I said, this is very kind of you, but I live by myself. And it had to be translated from English into the Pao. And it took a little while until everybody got the news. And then I think, never ever in my life have so many people looked at me with such a pity. He lives by himself, this poor man. And then they got kind of tense. And only later, my Burmese friend explained to me why. Because in Burma, you do not live alone. You always live with your family. And the only people who live by themselves are these really nasty, mean people nobody wants to live with. So they thought this guy, he makes a good impression. What's wrong with him that nobody wants to live with him? I didn't know that at that time, but I sensed that they are kind of anxious now. So I explained to them that I was living in Hong Kong. My wife was living in New York. But hey, I call her every night. Oh, was really translate back into Bao. Oh, they were very, very happy. Oh, he calls her every night. Wow. And then the village head looked at me and said, really? I said, yes. Wow, you must have a loud voice then. That was when I realized they thought Hong Kong is on top of a hill and New York is a village on top of another hill. And I just go, at the edge of my village and call, Anna. So I realized they really had not much of a clue what was going on, but neither had I. And I was introduced to this warmth, this friendliness. And when I went back to Burma the next year, I really wanted to visit that village again. So I did. I went to Cologne, my friend took me there, and it was a big welcome, and I had bought gifts for the kids, and it was really fun. Everybody was happy, and at night, again, we met at a much bigger house, and there was something special. There was a cabinet. The cabinet was closed, and we all had to sit in front of the cabinet. And I realized something was going on here. Maybe a big, something special for the guest of honor or so. Maybe they would present me with another nice gift, or they were all excited because there was something they wanted to show to me. So at a certain time, we all got very quiet. The village head stood up. He opened the cabinet, and what was inside? A TV set. In the meantime, the military had given away TV sets, run on batteries, because they wanted to spread their propaganda. But people were not stupid. They didn't watch the stupid propaganda, but what they watched was a movie. Once a week, if I remember correctly, there was a foreign movie shown on TV. And this was my lucky night. They wanted to show that to me. And for 45 minutes, no subtitles, no translation. It was all in English. One of the worst movies, TV series I'd ever seen. Set in Los Angeles, I think. Not much happened except that cars crashed into each other. People got shot and killed. I remember a helicopter exploded. I had to watch that for 45 minutes in English, and people started looking at me because I looked suspiciously like these people who kept killing each other. Then it was over. Very quiet. The headman got up. He closed the cabinet again. He turned around and looked at me, full of pity. Then he said, Jan-Phillip, if you like, you can stay with us. It seems to be very dangerous where you are come from. So again, that taught me a lesson, many lessons actually, as my Burmese friends and all the people I've met over the years in Burma have taught me many, many lessons. Sometimes I understood right away. Sometimes I didn't understand at all. Sometimes we argued. That's also a big point, things I don't agree with. I remember on one trip, I was introduced to 3 young men because I was doing research for a story. And it was a very sad story, a common story in Burma in those days in the late 90s. The military was fighting different civil wars because in Burma you have the Burmese and then you have 135 ethnic minorities. And some of them are pretty big and they want their own independent states. So since the founding of the state in 48 or 49, they've been fighting. And in those years, they used a lot of landmines and the military didn't have enough landmine detectors. So what they did, they used people. They surrounded whole villages and they kidnapped all the young men and they used them as porters and as landmine detectors. Horrible stories I heard. And these 3 men, not many survived that because you had to walk in the jungle or over the rice paddies. If there was a mine, you stepped on it, the mine exploded, you were killed and the mine was gone. So that was a way to clean the land. And these 3 people told me horrible stories, how they were mistreated, tortured, and then abused as landmine detectors, but they had survived, they were lucky. And I got so angry about the way they were treated. And at one point I said, you must be so angry, you must hate these people, the soldiers who did that to you. And they were very calm. They said, oh no, that was our karma. I said, what? Yeah, you must have done something terrible in our previous lives that we deserved this. So me coming from the West, we got into a heated argument. And I said, they're perpetrators, they're killers, torturers. They have to be held accountable. They have to be put on trial. And they were, no, this is our karma, we deserve this. So those are moments where really, I can't go any further in terms of understanding. I realize I'm not a Burmese, even though many of my Burmese friends believe I was a Burmese in a previous life. That's why I write so many books about them. But no, I'm not. I come from a Western country with different values, different culture, and I couldn't understand it. It was really, and I wanted to write a story in those days, but I couldn't. Stern wasn't interested. I was very disappointed because these 3 guys, they had risked their lives to talk to me in those days. And then when I wrote A Well-Tempered Heart, I remembered their stories. And I could put all that into the book, which made me very happy that it was not useless, it was not a waste of time for them. I put it in the book, it's part of the story, what the military did to its people. And in those days I understood what a brutal dictatorship it actually was. And I learned a lot. This was one way, karma, and a different, also a Buddhist approach, which also is important in the 2nd book and in the 3rd book, remembers. There's another friend who was tortured by the military. He was sentenced to jail for 8 years, really suffered a lot, and he told me his story. And again, he was very quiet. And I said, you tell me this horrible story, how you were mistreated, tortured. He showed me his scars on his legs. And you seem so calm. You must hate these people. Or do you also believe in karma? And he said, that's not the reason why I don't hate them. I was released from jail and I hated them. I hated them so much. And then I realized I was still a prisoner. I was a prisoner of my hatred. I kept thinking about these people. I kept thinking about my time in jail. I wasn't free. And I realized the only person who could set me free, who could liberate me from this prison, was me, myself, I. And I did. I went to a monastery. I started meditating more and more. And I understood that I have to forgive. Because only when I forgive, if I don't hate anymore, I'm a free man. And he was a free man. So that was another big lesson I learned in Burma from a friend. And as you can imagine, that had deep, deep, deep impact on me and on my books. I mean, you find the Art of Healing Heartbeat. It's a wonderful, wonderful love story, very enchanting, very encouraging, because it's about the most powerful force or energy in our lives. It's love, and it's a positive energy. Nowadays, we read and hear so much about hatred and violence, and it's always been with us. But I think the most powerful force with us is a positive force, and that's called love. And I think that's what the Art of Healing Heartbeat is about. The second book and the third book, they are also about love, but in different ways. I will talk about the new book a little later. But the second book also is about the difficult art of forgiving and how important it is, a well-tempered heart. And then something amazing happened. Things changed in Burma. In 2010, I think the military realized they were still isolated. The world was moving on, and Burma was falling further and further behind. And they started political reform. There was Aung San Suu Kyi, the opposition leader. She had been under house arrest for 15 years. She was freed. There were first elections, by-elections, small elections, but she participated. They won some seats. And the country very slowly opened up. The general was still in charge, but he was a very liberal-minded general, and he opened the country up. Foreign investment came in, NGOs came in, the media. All of a sudden, there was no fear anymore. It was amazing, freedom of the press. And to see, if you had seen the country for 15 years so suppressed, and the military and the fear, and then it was like an awakening. I went there once, twice a year in those days, sometimes 3 times a year. And it was a fantastic experience. You could see it in people's eyes that the fear was gone. The young were so thirsty. The internet came. When I first came to Burma, in all of Kalao, I think there was one telephone. Nowadays, Burma has more SIM cards than citizens. And the internet is so good, not anymore, but before the coup d'etat in February, it was faster than here in Germany. It was unbelievable. I could sit in Kalao in the tea house and watch a movie. It's difficult here in Germany because the broadband is not so good or Wi-Fi. So they jumped. They jumped 100 years. And it was, I think, a privilege to witness that as a friend of the country, as somebody who has been there so often, how people changed, how so many positive things, I have to say. As I said, many NGOs, and then my first 2 books were published in Burma, which was a great honor. And they are big, big bestsellers in Burma, which is lovely for me, of course, makes me very happy, very proud to a certain extent. And I went to readings, which was fantastic, to Kalao and Yangon. And I remember one reading in Kalao, there were people coming from Yangon, which is a 10-hour bus ride, just to participate. And they had to sign books, and Burmese books. And I remember one young man came to me, he spoke some English, and he said he loves my books for 3 reasons. They make him cry, they comfort him, and he learned so much about his own country by reading them. So I thought that's quite a compliment, and I was very, very moved, very happy. And I think it has to do with my friends who helped me in my many trips. They helped me doing research. They interpret the country, the culture, the people, if I don't understand them. So spending so much time there is just incredibly important because obviously I'm not Asian, I'm not Burmese, at least not in this life. So if this is authentic, I have to research it. I have to put a lot of time in there, being there, just watching, just observing. And that's what I have been doing. And for the first, and of course then for the third book as well. Yeah, and then it got more and more positive, the atmosphere. It was, of course, it had dark sides. I don't want to say it was all positive. The last 10 years, the country developed, the economy, a lot of new buildings, a lot of environmental pollution. I remember riding a train used to be fantastic because you rode very slowly. The trains in Burma are very slow. You rode and you only saw villages and rice paddies. And I remember 3 years ago, I was on a ride from Yangon to Kalau, basically. And I watched out, and what did I see? Plastic all over. And I was devastated. And in front of me in the train, there was a family of 4, and they had just had their dinner, and they had bought it at the train station, and it was all wrapped and packed and plastic. And when they had finished the dinner, what did they do? They threw it all out of the window. And I got so angry. I said, I can't believe this. Why do they throw it out? And my friend who was traveling with me, a Burmese friend, said, yeah, so what do you do with the garbage in a train in Germany? Oh, I said, you put it in the garbage, trash can. I looked around and said, oh, there are no trash cans here. Okay, then I collected, and at the next stop when I get off the train, I put it in a trash can. But of course, nobody in Burma, are there any trash cans at train stations? So I said, okay, then I would take it home. And then my friend told me that there were only 2, 3, 4, 5 towns in all of Burma where there's a kind of a garbage collection by the government. Otherwise, you are left with your garbage. So what do you do if nobody comes and collects it? Be honest, wherever you are, Pacific or New York, wherever you are watching me, how long would you collect your garbage in your living room or your kitchen until you start throwing it out in the woods or in the next river or whatever? I mean, I guess we would all do. That's what they do because they don't have a choice. So, of course, this rapid development brings in problems as well, and but they have to find their own way. And up until the 1st of February, they were really, I think, heading into the right direction. And then the coup d'etat happened. Now the military is in charge again, and it definitely devastated me. But I would like to talk about that a little later. First, now I would like to talk a little bit about the third book. You already heard a little bit about it from my lovely host. I will talk a little bit more. It took 7 years from A Well-Tempered Heart, which came out in 2014, to The Heart Remembers in 2021. That's a long time. I had 2 other projects, but I think it took me a long time because this is a very personal and very emotional book. And I always say, if I want to make my readers laugh and cry, I have to laugh and cry first. And so I did, but I wrote it. It was a very emotional experience. A lot of themes. I think it's a very complex book. So at the core, it's about love, but it's not just about love between a man and a woman. It's also about love between Kobobo and Uba, which is uncle and nephew. Age-wise, it's more grandchild and grandfather because Uba is 80 and Kobobo is 12. And I learned about the relationship between the young and the old in Burma as well, because I have a good friend. She lived with her grandmother. She was 18, 20. The grandmother was 80. And sometimes I visited her. And I saw how nicely she took care of her grandmother. One time I remember I came and she was washing her hair. It was lovely. She had long gray hair. And the careness, the tenderness, the kindness with the way my friend washed the hair of her grandmother was really moving. And then she clipped the fingernail and the toenails, and then the grandma had pain, and my friend massaged her legs. And that's what you do. The young do that with the old, because in Burma, who takes care of the old people? There are no homes, retirement homes where you put them. There are no people from other countries you can hire to do that for you. I mean, it's a family, and especially the young. So I learned from that, and I put all that into the book because Kobobo and Uba, they really have a very close relationship. At the beginning, of course, Uba takes care of Kobobo, but now Kobobo is 12 and Uba is getting old. So now actually it's more like Kobobo is taking care of Uba than the other way around. Kobobo's father only comes once, twice a year, and as you learned, his mom stays away for unknown reasons. And of course, Kobobo is curious, but again, this very Burmese, you don't ask. I mean, you don't ask too many questions. People tell you something or they don't. And there seems to be a family secret, and no matter whether you're in USA or Germany or in Burma, nobody likes to talk about family secrets, and they don't. So Kobobo has this longing, of course, for his parents, but he's happy with Uba as well. And then one night he wakes up and Uba, who sleeps next to him, is gone. So he's shocked. He wakes up and then he hears a very strange sound in the living room, and he goes and he watches and he sees old Uba. There's a candle light and he is sitting in front of a typewriter and he writes something. Kobobo goes back to sleep. The next morning, Uba's asleep and Kobobo checks the whole hut, and eventually he finds a typewriter and some papers, some notes of Uba. And he knows he is not supposed to read it, but he's so curious. He wants to know what Uba is doing at night. So he struggles for a few minutes, but then he is too curious. He starts to read. And usually I don't read at my readings because I prefer you reading my book yourself instead of me reading it to you, or listen to it. There's a wonderful recording of this book, audiobook. But this time I just read a few sentences because they are very important for the book. So Kobobo knows he's not supposed to read, but he has to. So he reads the first few sentences Uba, his uncle, wrote down. They demanded a courage of themselves beyond the strength of their hearts. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. She had no plan but a dream. He had neither one nor the other. He was afraid. And of course, fear is the natural enemy of love. A person who loves has no fear. A person who fears cannot love, only cling. Both were prisoners in their own worlds who believed they could free one another if only they loved sufficiently. Love can accomplish many miracles, but it could not fulfill this hope. A hope as old as love itself. So Kobobo knows what Uba is writing down here is the story of his parents. And now he wants to know. He wants to know the story of his parents, why he doesn't live with them and what happened. And I don't want to give it away. I don't want to spoil because that's what the book is about, the story of the parents, the love story. Again, this time about a man and a woman and the difficulties they have, and between the love between a child and his parents. What I did this time, the other books are set, even though Julia, the main character, is a lawyer from New York. In the first book, she's searching for her father in Calore. In the second book, she's basically searching for herself. In the third book, she lives in Burma now. She has found the love of his life. And what I did this time, most of the book is set in Burma, but this time I also traveled to New York. Because Burma, the New York lawyer, she wants to go back. She's pregnant and she doesn't want to give birth in Burma. She wants to give birth in New York, and she takes her lover, Tata, with her to New York. And those are very it's an unlikely match. The successful lawyer from New York, Julia, is kind of an archetype of a modern woman. She is professionally very successful, but she doesn't have a family, doesn't have children, friend. She feels lonely. She is in the search of meaning. She wants belonging and intimacy. At the same time, she's afraid of it. And now she found her love and they go to New York so that she can give birth. And now I try to describe New York from the point of view of a Burmese. He is a poor Burmese, a monk, very smart man. He knows a lot about life and love, but he has never been outside his village, basically. And now he is in New York. And I lived in New York for 8 years. And I went again to New York to do research. For this, my wife first thought it just an excuse to go to New York again. But it was important for me because I wanted to see how might the Burmese look at New York. And I walked around for a few days, and I remember the first morning I walked by the homeless. And when you lived in New York or live in New York, you're used to it, sadly. So I walked by. And then I thought, what would a Burmese do? I mean, we as humans, what would we do if we see a helpless person in front of us? I think our human instinct is to help. We don't do that for many, many reasons. We're used to it and so on. We're afraid. But I think our first, unfiltered human instinct is to help another human being. And that's what Tata does. And of course, if you help a homeless person in New York and take him to hospital, you get a lot of trouble. And so he does. So I try to describe the cultural differences. And the big question is the life between Julia and Tata strong enough to build a bridge over these differences? I can't tell you because you have to figure it out by reading the book. Yeah, now I've talked a little bit about the book, and now before we come to the questions, if you have any, I talk about the things that happened in Burma lately, or Myanmar. You might have seen it. There was a coup d'etat on February 1st, and I didn't see it coming. I was devastated, as many Burmese. It was terrible because they were on the right path. They were on the right side of history, I think. They had election in November, and the governing party, the NLD, had won it by a landslide. And it was not a full democracy because the military still controlled the three most important ministries. They were not under civilian rule. So it was not but they were on their way. And then the Democratic Party won by landslide, and then the coup happened. I still don't know why. I think they made the most terrible mistake because they were still in charge, the military, but I think they were afraid that they might lose some of their power because they are incredibly corrupt. They have amassed billions, and they are incredibly violent. So I think there were a lot of people who might have thought eventually they have to be held accountable, and maybe they have to give some of the money back. And I think they were afraid of that day, and they thought it's better to take power again. And since then, the first few weeks were very inspiring. People were demonstrating. There were millions of people out on the streets, and it was almost like a political carnival. It was really fantastic. Everybody was out there, bodybuilders and beauty queens and workers. And I saw images. Every day for 2 or 3 hours, I was online on Facebook, Twitter, and so on. I saw scenes, I saw movies, I was in contact, I posted. I have many followers in Burma as an author. And then it got darker and darker, and then it got very violent. By now, I think more than 1,000 people have been killed. Thousands are arrested in jail. Some of my friends are living underground now because they are too scared. A beautiful colleague of mine, a writer, was just murdered a few days ago in prison. It is absolutely horrible what is going on. The military is as brutal, as corrupt, and is as incompetent as ever. And they are taking back the country into the dark ages and decades, and people are just desperate. Every day I get messages from friends, young and old, please help us. Is there anything you can do? Why isn't the UN stepping in? Why is the world leaving us? It's terrible because us from the outside, there's really not that much we can do. And it's really, there are 400,000 soldiers and 54 million Burmese, and they are all hostages. It's like an occupying force. They do whatever they want. There's no freedom whatsoever anymore. Leader Aung San Suu Kyi, she is again on house arrest, and she's on trial. They dissolved the NLD, the Democratic Party. So it will be a few probably years, very hard, difficult years for Burma. And I just hope maybe this will be the end of the dictatorship, because now people will see there's no way you can compromise with soldiers, not with these at least. And they still had a lot of power, and maybe now people understand they have to give up the power completely. A military has to be under civilian rule. That's it, point, period. And but it will take a long time, and it makes me very sad. I sat here with goosebumps when I watched the videos, sometimes with tears in my eyes, because I know these people. They are my people. I know them, and yeah, it's painful to watch. I wrote an open letter to an unknown Burmese soldier, telling him not to aim at people, shoot in the air. I don't know if it was read. It was shared in Burma by hundreds of thousands of people. But there's really not much we can do from the outside. Some of them, you get an idea in the Heart Remembers. It's set in 2019, but it goes all the way back to 2007, and there was the monk uprising. So that plays an important part in the new book, the monk uprising. But as I said, I don't want to spoil it, and I don't want to give it away. I just hope I took you on a little trip to Burma, and I hope I made you curious about the art of training heartbeats, a well-tempered heart, and a heart remembers. Would be my honor if you pick up a book and read it. So now I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan-Phillip. It's having been there, I understand so much of what you're saying, that people are just incredible people. And we were so fortunate to have a similar experience where we went up into the hills, into a village, and were able to take to see their openness and generosity. So it is really difficult right now, knowing what's going on. I'm curious, given how strongly this series evokes the sights and sounds of Burma, what role did the setting play in your approach to telling Julia's story, and what is the importance of setting in the Heart Remembers?
I think it's very, very important. It's not one of these books where you use an exotic setting to tell a familiar story. I think really the Burmese spirit, the spirituality, the religion, Buddhism, the way of thinking, their value plays an important part, because Julia is confronted with them. I mean, she has to question herself, her own approach to life, her values, because she lives in Burma now, and it's a very different life, and it's a challenge every day. And I have a couple of friends, mixed couples, foreigners who have lived in Burma for many years, and I talked to them about it, how it feels and what a challenge it is. So I think Burma, its culture, its daily life, everything it's part of the book. It's a fabric of the book. Mm-hmm. So it's essential.
Right. And how do you feel now? I was curious about this. Now that you've completed the series, what do you hope the audience will take away from reading The Heart Remembers? Obviously, a sense of the Burmese people, but for those of us who loved the story and the books, and now are sad to see them end. How do you feel about it? The end of the trilogy.
It's a good question. For me, it's a good question. And I have to admit, I don't think that way, because I can't tell what people take away from any of my books, because we all read different books, right? You don't even read the book I write, because you read your own book, and your friend might read another book. It's all the same, but we, read it differently, and you might take away something different than your husband or your mother or whoever. So for an author to say, I want people to take this away, I can't say that, but no, and it's maybe more propaganda or something, or maybe an essay, non-fiction or so. In fiction, I just follow whatever comes out, me. And I can just hope that people do take something away from it. And from my reading, sometimes I am really fascinated when there are Q&As and people ask me questions, and they read the book in a way I thought, wow, that's also a way to look at it. I never thought about it.
Yeah.
And that's what they got out of it.
Yeah.
So I just know the book came out in Germany 2 years ago, and in some other countries a little while ago. It was extremely well received, sold a lot of books, moved a lot of people. I got great reviews and responses. I think maybe one thing, what was important for me was this thing in New York, just again to see somebody coming to New York with this Burmese background, and so he sees a woman in a restaurant, and he is fascinated by her, and Julia asks him, so why do you stare at her? Say, yeah, I don't understand. She looks so young. Her face looks like a 30-year-old, but her hands, they look like she's an old woman. What is she? I mean, of course, he had never seen something, and then they get into an argument about facelifting and all this. So that was kind of, but whatever you take out of it, that's up to you, not up to me.
Yeah.
And I was afraid I would be very sad when the trilogy is over, because the first book, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, came out in Germany in 2002.
Oh, wow.
So these characters have been with me for 20 years.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And it was fine. I could let them go. I think the trilogy, the story was told. I could let go of Julia and Tata, Uba and Kobobo. So it was fine. I felt good.
Okay, that's good. I mean, as far as takeaway, I think that's one of the things books like yours, they take us to faraway places. And as I mentioned in my introduction, your first book inspired me to want to go to this incredible country. And I think for others who may not, travel as much for whatever reason, I think they get a really strong sense of what the people are like. And that's very powerful what you said about the experience in New York. And I just actually returned from New York visiting my daughters. And it, even coming from California, you walk around and you look at it differently, but to look at it through the eyes of someone from a culture, an Asian culture especially, is I think a really important experience for us to be more empathetic and look through eyes of other cultures. So yeah. So let's see. What felt different or similar about writing The Heart Remembers compared to writing The Art of Hearing Heartbeats and A Well-Tempered Heart? Did you approach it in a way that, oh, this is the end, or I'm just curious how that worked for you?
I mean, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats was my first novel, and I was very naive. I just wrote down what came out, and it was an incredible experience, your first novel. I didn't think much, and it was never planned as a trilogy. The book was over, and it was over. And at the beginning, it wasn't very successful. And I remember I was sitting in Cologne many years later, and I'm a daydreamer. So I was sitting in my favorite tea house, and I was wondering, and I had the sense, in my fantasy, Julia character, the American character from the first book, came down the road and said, hey, Julia, hey, how have you been? Sit down with me and let's have a chat. How have you been? What did the story of The Art of Hearing Heartbeat do to you, and so on? So I got into a chat, what happened to her, and that got so interesting. And I thought, maybe there's a story in it. And I went back to Germany and I started writing. And out of nowhere, the story came. And then I had all my research. And so that was the Well-Tempered Heart. But the Well-Tempered Heart, at the end, is very open. I don't want to give it away, but it's really, at the end of A Well-Tempered Heart, I knew I wanted to write one more book because I wanted to know how the story evolves and continues. So I knew that The Heart Remembers, but again, that was, I had a lot of thinking and how could I structure it and what would happen with Julia and Tata. As I said, it took me a long time, much longer than I expected.
Yeah. I find that really interesting how some authors go into writing a book anticipating there's going to be additional books, and some people just, I think they write it, and like you said, then it just comes to them that the characters have more life in them. So it's really interesting. So let's see. Was traveling to Burma, well, this question, was traveling to Burma critical in the creation of The Heart Remembers? How did you use travel as a device within the narrative? And I mean, I think you sort of answered that already, but maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's just, as I explained, I could not have written these books without being in Burma or traveling, going there so often.
Right.
Sometimes people wonder, my friends here, my family, why do you have to go again? You have been there so often. And it's sometimes I just go there without any agenda. I travel there for 2 or 3 weeks across the country and just watch, observe, talk to people, take notes. And in the end, somehow they show up in the books.
Yeah.
They are somewhere deep inside me, and I'm like a gold digger. All of a sudden, they are there.
Right.
And that's fascinating how much you take in while you're traveling without even noticing it. And I remember in the first book, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, there's this Tin Win who, turns blind and can see, but he can hear so well that he can hear heartbeats from afar. And he falls in love with Mimi, and she cannot walk. She has crippled feet, and he carries her, so she becomes his eyes, he becomes her legs, and a metaphor for, complete love. And I remember when I wrote that, all of a sudden I remembered watching a girl in a market in Burma with crippled feet. And I had watched her, I had forgotten about her, but then it came up again, the image and how she moved with such dignity again and very slow, but beautiful to watch. And that image came back. I had watched it, forgotten about it, and then it popped up again. And that's how it is. When I wrote these books, so many stories and images came back.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. So the epistolary novel is a rich literary tradition that dates back to the 15th century. How did the letters, Yuba's and Julia's, add another layer of meaning to the story in your book?
Yeah, it's a good question. Uba is the storyteller. It's written in first person by Julia, the first book, but most of the story is told by Uba. The same with the second book. Julia is the writer, the person, but most of the story is told by Uba to Julia. The third book, for whatever reason, I didn't want Julia to write it. So I wanted to keep the same structure that Uba is telling Julia and Tata's story, but I was wondering to whom. And then Kobobo appeared. But I wanted to have different voices. And one easy way as a writer to add another voice is a letter or a diary. So the book is this time actually Kobobo writes it as the person, but Uba tells a lot of the story. Kobobo does. But also I wanted to give Julia a voice, and that is through her letters to her son and her diaries. So it's kind of a little trick to give her a voice, and I hope it works.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. You spoke about the current unrest in Burma and some of your activism, and the connection between how you portray Burma in your novels and anti-democratic injustices happening on the ground there now. What is our role as readers and writers in moments of crisis? Like right now, what can we do for those of us concerned about what's going on in Burma or Myanmar?
That is a good question. I realized how much it means to them when I post something, and right away I have hundreds of likes and comments and so on, how much it means to them to know that we are watching, that they are not forgotten. The criminals can't be brought to justice now, but we are watching.
Right.
And however you can express that, you can call or write to your representative, because of course America is a very powerful country. There's not that much they can do, but they can talk to China, they can talk to the neighbors, ASEAN countries, to Japan. They have influence in Burma. China, Japan, ASEAN, they have. So the US, they can put some pressure on Norwegians or Swedish, Germans. They can put pressure on our governments not to recognize the military, for instance. There's an underground government now, the elected government. So not to talk to the military, but recognize the legal government, which is underground now. You can right? You can post things, you can watch, and even if people maybe they sense it that we are watching, that we don't forget them, and I think that is very important to them.
Yeah. Well, that's thank you so much. That's a very powerful way to end. I think that we do have to remember them and know that they're in our hearts and our thoughts. And
Yes,
especially after reading your books, it warms us to people like the Burmese. And so thank you so much for this wonderful series. We, as readers, we really appreciate it and look forward to seeing what comes next. So.
thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
You're
It
welcome.
was really my pleasure.
Good. And here's the lovely book. They always have beautiful covers, and
Yes,
you can, of course, purchase this at Book Passage. You can get it online. You can come to one of our stores. We are open, which is nice. Corte Madera and San Francisco at the Ferry Building. Feel free to call us or order online. And thank you again for being here and supporting Book Passage and supporting authors. And we look forward to seeing you in our next event. Take care. Thank you.
thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.